WHAPers! We're here today to go over your Unit 2 packet for this week. Julius just wanted to pop in and say hello. He got to be on the WHAP video yesterday and now he's just a star, so he's desperate for the attention. Alright, so our packet starts with a timeline. The time period that we're looking at for this unit is 1450 to 1750, so it gives you a little bit of information about things that happened during that time period, and then it jumps into the key concepts, which remember are just like these big chunks of information that you need to know. So the first one is looking at globalizing networks of communication and exchange. It asks you to define cartography. Cartography is just the art and science of making maps. So that's an important development, is that cartography is going to be continuing to develop and evolve, and maps are going to get better and more accurate. And that's going to be important, of course, when we look at navigation, because if you're going different places, you need to know where you're going accurately. And then it asks you about the caravel and how did it improve travel. We talked about this a little bit on the last video, but basically the caravel was the Portuguese version of these very large ships. And having those more advanced shipbuilding techniques is going to be important for travel and trade and communication, because of the fact that they could go faster and they could go further than ever before. And so a caravel is going to be just one of the names that's given to these big ships that are going to be able to sail very long distances. And the next thing it talks about is the new transoceanic maritime reconnaissance that occurred during this period. Just know the word reconnaissance just refers to like exploration. So it asks, what did the Portuguese do in order to try to create a trading post empire? So basically what they did is establish trading posts all along the west coast of Africa, as well as throughout the Indian Ocean. And in doing that, they're going to basically monopolize trade there. They're going to be the first Europeans to be on the west coast of Africa, the first Europeans to really control the trade in the Indian Ocean, as opposed to the Muslim merchants that had been there before. So they're going to be able to monopolize trade by establishing those trading post empires, and they're going to create what's called the Cartay system. And the Cartay system is going to be a system of like tariffs and taxes, where they're going to require ships that want to do any kind of trading to pay the Portuguese in order to do that. And so that's going to establish their control over those regions. At the very bottom of the page, it asks you what country sponsored the voyages of Christopher Columbus. That would be Spain. Remember, he wasn't Spanish, he was Italian, but he was hired by the Spanish to sail on their behalf.
From Genoa.
Why were Columbus's travels so important for the world at the time, and what did they start? So basically, Columbus's travels are going to be the first transfers between the Eastern and Western hemispheres. Remember, we had some interaction before with like the Vikings, but the first time that things are going to be actually transferred is going to be with Columbus, where he's going to go back and forth between the two hemispheres and bring things back and forth. And that's going to be really important, because it's not only going to really accelerate that transoceanic exploration that's going on during the time period, but also because of the fact that it's going to launch that colonization of the New World, the Americas. It gives you some more information there about like the Columbian Exchange, and then the next question it asks is the circulation of what precious metal from the Americas was intimately tied to commercialization and the creation of a global economy. The answer to that would be silver. If you remember when we talked about the silver trade that Spain is going to have coming out of South America, the big silver mine Potosi that's going to be in like present day Bolivia, that's really going to revolutionize trade, because of the fact that they're going to be able to make the first standardized currency out of those silver coins. Mercantilism, the next question is about mercantilism and what is it? Mercantilism is basically just the economic theory of the time period, in which countries were expected to gain colonies, have a collection of bullion, which is precious metal, and to have a favorable balance of trade. And so that's where you have the creation of like joint stock companies for that purpose, and of course the mass colonization of different areas of the world, is because of that mercantilist policy. The next thing that we're looking at is joint stock companies. Joint stock companies are going to be new methods used by European rulers to control economies and compete in global trade. So it just asks you a little bit about the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company, which were both joint stock companies of the time period. So the Dutch East Indian Company is going to be in primarily like Indonesia, where Indonesia is today, in Southeast Asia. And essentially the Dutch are going to go and they're going to be granted a monopoly over the spice trade out of Southeast Asia, which is huge. It's going to make the Dutch a lot of money. And it's going to allow the Dutch to exert control over those Southeast Asian countries. The other one is the British East Indian Company. That's going to be based out of India. And that is going to essentially do the same thing. It's going to give the British a monopoly on trade out of India. So they're going to have control over all of those major exports, things like tea and spices and opium and indigo, all of those really significant, lucrative cash crops and products that India had. So the British East Indian Company is going to control the trade from South Asia to Europe. They're slowly going to use that power that they have economically to build their empire in India, and then eventually we know that's going to weaken the Mughal Empire and establish Britain as the main source of power in South Asia.
On the map below, label the following locations to show the movement of goods, wealth, free and unfree laborers as part of the Atlantic system. So Africa, the Americas, and Europe. This is all part of the Triangular Trade Network, or the Atlantic Circuit, as it's referred to by many historians. So it's clear to see on the map that Europe is going to benefit the most from this, and that's going to be number 2. Number 1, obviously, the Americas, and then number 3, Africa. Because they're going to be taking in these goods like sugar, tobacco, cotton, and just basically any cash crops into mainland Europe, and then they're going to manufacture these products, come out with textiles, rum, and manufactured goods to basically send to Africa in exchange for slaves along the west coast. And then they're going to ship those slaves to the Americas along the Middle Passage to then basically support their labor systems in the New World. And they're getting the raw materials that they need to kind of fuel their new economies. So the next one says to define indentured servitude. So this is just a form of unfree labor in which someone's working to pay off a debt. So basically, debtors' prisons in Europe were getting full, and they would allow for citizens to work in the New World colonies to basically live for 7 years, work on the land, and basically make a profit for the European landowners, and in that way their debt would be forgiven after that period of time that they're going to spend basically working the land for them. Part 5 of this key concept says the new connections between the Eastern and Western hemispheres resulted in the Columbian Exchange. Part of the Columbian Exchange that's not covered here that you have to fill in is going to be the impact on Afro-Eurasia as it relates to food. There are 2 crops listed for you, maize and sugar, that are going to be crucial to this New World connection. Maize or corn is going to be a new cuisine, basically high in caloric values. Eventually, this is going to contribute to population growth, and you'll see a doubling of the population leading up into 1750. And the increase in sugar consumption because of this New World plantation economies that they've developed is going to increase the demand for African slaves. So it's only going to add to the intensification of slave labor in the Americas and the Atlantic slave trade. The next question says, what's the difference between staple crops and cash crops? So cash crops are going to be luxury goods. You're basically going to be able to profit immensely off of these items. Whereas when we talk about staple crops, those are items that you can't survive without them. So you're going to need them for, sustainable agriculture for your population. And that's going to be something that's important as we get to this, kind of modern era, towards the end of the period, or early modern era. You're going to have more people, and the more people you have, the more food you need. As well as plants that can survive things like the Little Ice Age. For example, potatoes. Part C says to explain each of the items' impact on the Americas. As this exchange continued and intensified, you're going to start to see Europeans bringing more and more to the Americas to not only set up their trading posts, but to now expand their control over the New World. So, for example, it's going to transform transportation in a way that now people can branch out even further and expand into, parts of the interior.
Previously, the Americas had only really had like llamas and alpacas as beasts of burden, so that prevented them from being able to travel long distances.
Next, we're going to have sugar. Obviously, this is going to be highly lucrative for those plantation economies, and it resulted in an increased and constant need for African slaves. So again, that intensification that we kind of see with sugar is important because it didn't originate in the New World, but it's something that is an old world good from India that is in a high demand now, to where Europeans are profiting off of this New World system. Our last box here is cattle, and that's going to transform the diet and the cuisine of people living in the New World from Europe, and also those already living there, the natives. So part E says European colonization affected the physical environment of the Americas, and then we're answering part 6 below. And it says the increase in interactions between newly connected hemispheres and intensification of connections within hemispheres expanded the spread and reform of existing religions and created syncretic belief systems and practices. So it says define syncretism. So when we're talking about cultural syncretism, we're talking about two or more things combining to create a new thing. For example, below it has defined Sikhism and how it developed. Sikhism is a belief system that's going to originate in South Asia and basically combine elements of Hinduism and Islam. As the Turkic people started to expand eastward and take control of India, and the Hindu populations there, you'll see these elements of their cultures blending together. Part 7, how did expanding literacy impact the lower classes? So this is now going to give you access to books. You can read. It's in the book. Everybody's going to have access to the Bible to interpret texts that have been basically coveted for such a long time before this point. Literacy rates are going to give more opportunities to those in the lower classes of society. It's going to give them a social status. It's also going to give them economic opportunities. So learning the common language at the time is going to help them basically get jobs. It allows them to participate in religion now and have their own belief systems that start to develop, and you start to see the Protestant Reformation take hold in Europe. So that's something that's really important for the time period. It really starts in 1450 and then goes all the way into what we'll talk about with the Enlightenment, post 1750, so the next unit. So below it has what playwright is depicted here. This is William Shakespeare, who is part of the Elizabethan culture in England. He's going to be sponsored basically by the patron of the art, Queen Elizabeth I, and she's going to basically help not only promote his works, but give a place to actually perform these works, the Globe Theatre in London. So explain his historical significance. He's going to write hundreds of plays basically and expand the English language. He's going to develop new words like bedroom. So these compound words that never existed before. He's basically going to introduce that into the English language and have a more kind of common language that's spoken by everyday people, which again helps give more of a status or a say to those in the lower classes of society.
Another work of literature from this time period that's really important is Don Quixote. That's the next picture that you see. Don Quixote is the name of the book that's written by Miguel de Cervantes. It's one of my personal favorites. And it is going to be the first modern novel. The way it's organized is going to be different than anybody had seen before with chapters. It's going to have a really distinctive plot. There's going to be subplots, themes. It's going to have satire into it. And so it's going to be the first modern novel because people are going to, after that point, when Don Quixote's written, they're going to start writing books to be like Don Quixote. And Don Quixote's also going to provide kind of an alternative to the super religious texts of the past, that Don Quixote is just like a fun story to read that's interesting, and it's not for educational purposes necessarily, it's just fun.
All right, so quick summary.
Shout out Don Quixote.
Quick summary of Don Quixote. You go crazy when you are in quarantine.
Ooh, it is about that. So the next key concept, 4.2, is looking at new forms of social organization and modes of production. So the first thing it asks is, what was the Little Ice Age and how long did it last? The Little Ice Age was basically a period of cooling in the climate. where the average temperatures decreased. And it lasted about 500 years, from about 1300-ish to about 1800-ish.
Hey, I'm Chief Meteorologist Alan Strom here. Yeah, I know his line.
All right, what impact did the Little Ice Age have on agricultural practices and the settlement of the Northern Hemisphere? Well, basically there are going to be food shortages because of the drop in temperatures. You're going to have widespread famine. There's actually a lot of speculation that widespread famine is one of the things that made the Black Death so
destructive.
Yeah, and overarching, and that it spread so fast is because people's immune systems were diminished because of the fact that they didn't have enough food to eat.
But they didn't have Grubhub like that.
There was no DoorDash back then. You're also going to have an increased consumption of potatoes because of the fact that potatoes were one of the only crops that wasn't really affected by the cooler temperatures. And you're going to have an increased demand for furs. So you're going to have a lot of expansion into Siberia, as well into the northern parts of like what we think of as Canada today, in order to get those furs to sell.
And did you actually know that the potatoes that are going to be used to fuel Russia are known as Rus potatoes, because it's referring to the Kievan Rus.
Like russet potatoes? Russet potatoes? I don't know, it's called russet.
No, I don't know. I just made it up.
Oh, cool. All right, the next page, it says traditional peasant agriculture increased and changed, plantations expanded, and demand for labor increased. These changes both fed and responded to growing global demand for raw materials and finished products. So you're looking at a chart, and it says to describe the two examples of the intensification of peasant labor. So the first one is Russian Siberia. I just mentioned that, but with the Little Ice Age, you're going to have an increased demand for furs, and so the people who are going to get those furs are often these peasant farmers that are going out to hunt these animals to be able to sell their pelts. Also during this time period, you have an increase in the population, and so because of that, these Russian peasant farmers are going to be growing a lot of grain in order to sustain their population. Russia's going to annex Siberia during this time period, and Siberia was very sparsely populated at the time, and so the Russians would actually give land grants to these peasant farmers to go and live in Siberia, and so that's going to increase that demand for peasant labor. The other example that it gives is Mughal India. In Mughal India, you're going to have an increased demand for peasant labor because of the fact that you have cotton and textiles that are in very high demand by that British East Indian Company to ship as much of that as possible to Europe. And so because of that, those peasant laborers are going to have to be working all the time to meet that demand. The next question it asks you to answer is with part C, and it says, why did the growth of the plantation economy increase the demand for slaves in the Americas? So basically, plantations are going to be these large farm complexes where they would grow cash crops. Cash crops are super lucrative crops that are grown and refined for, these finished products. And to be able to grow these cash crops on the scale that they needed at the time, they would have to have a lot of labor. And for them to make a lot of money, they had to not pay the people who did all that labor. So that's going to increase that demand for slaves. Of course, when you look at certain ones as well, like sugar, it's a very dangerous process to refine sugar. And so because of that, a lot of the African slaves are going to die very early on. I think the average lifespan was like 23 years old. And so because of that, they weren't living into, sexual maturity to have children. And so the need for African slaves is going to be constant because none of them were being born in the New World. For letter D, it says colonial economies in the Americas depended on a range of coerced labor. And so it gives you a few examples for you to define. The first one is chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is basically a version of slavery in which the slaves are bought and sold as products. They're not considered to be people whatsoever. This is what you see in the 1500s, 1600s with that Atlantic slave trade.
And it's dehumanization. It's the exact same thing that we look at for a sign of genocide. And this is going to be, a massive genocide that takes place over this time period.
The next one is indentured servitude. Curdy Cake's already covered that a little bit, but basically indentured servitude is going to be a form of unfree labor in which the servant is working to pay off some kind of debt. This was very common during that period of colonization because a lot of people wanted to come to the New World, so somebody would pay for them to actually make the journey, and then they would work for that person for a period of time to pay off that debt. The last one is the encomienda system. The encomienda system was used in Latin America. This is going to be under the control of the Spanish. And during this time period, the Spanish would actually grant land to Spanish colonists, and they would give them a certain number of Native Americans that would work for them. And the idea was that it would be kind of an even exchange because the natives would work for the Spanish, but the Spanish would in turn take care of the natives. They would protect them. They would teach them how to speak Spanish and that kind of thing. Of course, that's not how it actually ended up. Most of the time, it just ended up being just blatant slavery of the Native Americans. And so the encomienda system is going to be a complete failure and fall apart. Okay, the next thing that it asks you to look at is to describe how and why the Manchus rose to power in China. So the Manchus are an ethnic group from north of China. We call the area Manchuria today, Manchu. And so that area north of China is going to be where they lived. They're going to notice that in China there was a lot of commotion during the time period. There was a lot of weakness of the Ming Dynasty. You had a lot of internal issues, and the Chinese had actually made that area of Manchuria pay tribute to them as part of that tribute system. And so the Manchus were kind of resentful towards China anyways. They noticed that there was this kind of opportunity that was given because of the time period was so chaotic in China. Then they are going to attack from the north, and they are going to be able to take over the Ming Dynasty and establish the new Qing Dynasty.
At the beginning of this historical period, you have exploration like we've already talked about. For example, Zheng He is going to sail on behalf of this Ming Dynasty that's going to fall at the hands of the Qing and the Manchus to the north. So basically, they're going to set up for this invasion and try to actually protect their state against foreign invasion by finishing the Great Wall, which actually isn't a singular wall. It's going to be, a series of fortifications around major cities in China to try to protect them from foreign invaders. So they're going to take funding away from exploration missions now because they never really were exploring. They were going on these political kind of campaigns where they were trying to drum up support for their tribute system in China and to keep them at this, current global status that they were at. But by taking away this funding, they're going to decrease their social status globally, and then what they're going to do is ensure their defeat to the Qing.
So the next thing that it asks of you is to describe the challenges to the authority of the daimyo in Japan. Remember, the daimyo are like the landlords within the Tokugawa shogunate, which is going to be that period of feudalism and Japanese serfdom that's going on in Japan. So basically the way that the daimyo are going to start losing power and authority is going to be, number one, because of internal division and internal fighting between different daimyos. You're going to see a lot of that consolidation happen. So if one landlord is fighting another landlord, whoever wins takes all of their land, and then there's only one landlord where there were two. So that's going to start to diminish the population of the daimyos. Also, during the Tokugawa period, you're going to have the shogun attempt to take more power. And so they're going to start imposing more restrictions on the daimyo as far as how much money that they have to pay to the emperor. And they're going to start having some strict requirements of the daimyo, and as far as like how many people they were allowed to control. And so all of those tiny steps are going to eventually severely diminish the power that those landlords had in Japan. The last question for 4.2 asks you, how did the Atlantic slave trade affect the demographics of Africa? Obviously, it's going to have a decrease in their population. That's not going to be overall, though, because of all the new foods that are coming into Africa. Africa's population actually is going to overall increase. However, it is going to severely diminish the male population in Africa, which has a huge effect on the demographics and the dynamics of Africa during this time period.
Okay, Key concept 4.3 is state consolidation and imperial expansion. So just as the Japanese were trying to consolidate power, rulers all throughout the world are going to be using this kind of same framework to try to embolden themselves and to try to take more control over their empires. So first we need to define legitimize, and that's just to make the system real or believable. And then consolidation, and that's just to make something stronger. So we have a chart here and it says religious ideas. We're basically going to go through and see how these ideas are going to affect a specific region or empire, and how they legitimize their power and how they consolidate their power through these religious actions. So the practice of human sacrifice is our first one for the Aztecs in Central America. Basically, this is going to help legitimize power because it instills fear and terror into their citizens. Sacrifices were basically intended to bring security and loyalty to those leaders from the people. So they're going to help kind of bond the people together. They, believe that these sacrifices are going to actually have, the intended effect as well. So if they were promised good harvest by the gods because of their sacrifice, and then they actually have a good harvest, that's going to help legitimize the system as well. Next, we have our notions of divine right. You can find this commonly practiced in the time period in Europe. And basically, this is the king gets power from God. So that divine right to rule elicits respect. And it's going to diminish opposition to kings and queens in the time period. Because they're going to use that kind of aspect of religion to consolidate and to legitimize their power. As we start to see this progression towards the Enlightenment, though, there's going to be a decrease in the effectiveness of divine right. All right, so last we have the use of Shi'ism or Shia Islam in the Safavid Empire, or you could say the Middle East. But specifically the Safavid Empire, because we have 3 Islamic empires in this historical time period that all kind of coincide with one another. That would be the Ottoman Empire, which actually got a little bit of an earlier start, the Safavid Empire, and then the Mughal Empire, all 3 Muslim empires, but very different in their religious practices when we look at the Safavids. The Safavids are going to be Shia Muslims, whereas the Ottoman and Mughals would be Sunnis. So they are the minority branch of Islam. And having the Safavid Empire is going to provide this safe haven and a migration into the empire and loyalty to the religious leader, or of the Shah. So the Shah of the Safavid Empire would legitimize his authority and power from his use of Shi'ism in the Safavid Empire. He's also going to use that for expansion tactics against their adversaries, the Ottomans and the Mughals to the east and west, in a way to expand their control of the region as well.
The next couple of questions give you a picture of monumental architecture, and it just asks you where is this piece of architecture from, like what empire is it associated with, and how is it used to legitimize a ruler's power. So the first one that we're looking at is the Taj Mahal. This was built during this time period in the Mughal Empire in South Asia. And how it was used to legitimize a ruler's power. Well, this was built as a burial place for the Mughal ruler's wife. And so, when you think about that, a normal everyday person can't afford to build a gigantic building to bury their wife in. So this is showing his power that he can actually build this elaborate mausoleum for her. And it's going to be very expensive. It's going to have a huge part in bankrupting the empire and weakening the Mughal Empire.
And then later Aurangzeb's going to get blamed for it.
And that's something that we're going to see a lot with this monumental architecture, is that that's one way that rulers legitimize their power, because they say, look at how much money I have, I can build these gigantic things. The next one that you're looking at, that picture, is actually the Palace of Versailles. This is going to be in Europe, specifically in France. It's going to be built by Louis XIV. It started out as just his personal hunting lodge, and then eventually he's going to make it into this gigantic palace complex that has its own zip code. So that's how big it is. It's basically a separated town that's going to be built with all kinds of luxuries for Louis XIV to house himself, his family, and all of the elites in France. And so this is basically going to legitimize his power by saying, hey, look at us. we have so much money and we have so much power that we can live in a completely separate town.
And have 1,000 servants live on the property as well.
And gold, fountains and
Opera
everything
house.
else.
Yeah. Okay, so part B says states treated different ethnic and religious groups in ways that utilized their economic contributions while limiting their ability to challenge authority of the state. Or the authority of the state. So this is going to be outlining the social hierarchy used in Latin America. We have 3 social classes here off of the castas, or the different caste used in the system. We have the mestizo class, which is just a mixed race person of European descent and native ancestry. A mulatto would be a mixed race person of African and European ancestry, and a Creole is going to be a person of European ancestry born in Latin America. So our last box here is asking you to identify elite classes or military professionals that are going to be used to basically help a ruler maintain their control of their centralized state or bureaucracy. So the Ottomans are going to use the Janissaries. And the Janissaries are basically enslaved eunuchs that are going to be trained to be loyal to the Ottoman Empire and actually going to be, converted to Islam. So that's going to be something that they use in the Christian Balkans to help legitimize authority and then help to consolidate their control of the region, is by, basically taking these children and converting them to Islam to work for their either government or the warrior class, the elites, the Janissaries. It's going to give them economic opportunities, so even those Christian families that were devout are going to, in a lot of cases, willingly turn over their children in hopes of a better life for them within the Ottoman realm.
And that system was called the Devshirme system.
Last, we have the Empire of Japan, who would use their samurai warriors, their military professionals here, as a way to help consolidate their power as well. So the samurai are going to have this kind of code of ethics to follow, the Bushido code, on how to act and basically how to provide intense loyalty and be devoted to honor the emperor of Japan and become disciplined as well. So it's going to have a massive impact on those warrior classes of elites in Japan on their devotion and loyalty to the emperor and helping him basically consolidate his power.
All right, the last page that we are looking at asks, how did the European establishment of new trading post empires in Africa and Asia affect the power of states in the interior of West and Central Africa? So a few things here. First of all, it would disrupt the local trade routes that they had, the traditional trade routes that they had in Africa, and so that's going to place an economic strain where they were forced to interact with the Portuguese. The Portuguese would oftentimes force these trade deals upon different groups of natives, and they would actually use the natives, kind of pit them against one another in order to get the best deals for things that the Portuguese wanted. So it's also going to increase hostility amongst native groups in Africa, and it's going to increase tribal warfare. And that tribal warfare is going to get very intense because of the fact that the Portuguese were actually selling these firearms to the African tribes. So after the Portuguese arrive, then the Africans are there's going to be a real shift in the dynamic in Africa where the Portuguese are clearly going to have the power there. The next thing that it asks about is the word maritime, and to define the word maritime. The word maritime just refers to anything relating to water. So in this context, it's asking you about maritime empires. And so when we talk about maritime empires, that just refers to any empire that expanded via water. So the very last chart that you're looking at here, it asks you to sort the 9 different empires as either land empires or maritime empires. So land empires expanded via land, maritime empires expanded via water. So the land empires on this list are the Manchu, the Mughals, the Ottomans, and the Russians. And then the maritime empires are the British, the Dutch, the French, the Portuguese, and the Spanish.
Okay, guys, we only have one more packet left to go, so hang in there. I know it's been kind of a struggle getting through these thick packets. Hopefully you're doing okay with that. Don't forget, if you have any questions for us, just to contact us through Teams or whatever way that you have to contact us.
And going back to school. So as you probably know by now, we aren't going to be returning to school this school year. We're both very upset about that because there's nothing that we want more than to be back in our classroom with you guys. And so I know this process is maybe frustrating, but Right now, we're just doing our best. So hang in there. We love you. We miss you. And for now, I suppose we will see you next week.
Bye.
Is that true? Why are you just making stuff up?
It sounds good.